What's up, everyone? Welcome back. It's another episode of Masari's Unqualified Opinions. I'm Ryan Selkis at 2-Bit Idiots. Have another awesome episode today for you with Alex Gladstein, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at the Human Rights Foundation. We're going to talk about Bitcoin, which is what we were always planning to talk about, but we're also going to talk about global public health and the role that authoritarian regimes have in constraining data and the impact that could have on public health. It's particularly timely given the coronavirus. I think people might get sick of talking about this, but unfortunately, for better or for worse, mostly for worse, I think Alex and I think this is not necessarily going away, so important to discuss not just what's likely to happen going forward, but some of the human rights implications. So timely conversation. I had the pleasure of meeting Alex, who's very flexible in chasing me down during the 15-minute window I had before I headed out from my most recent trip to SF. And I'm glad we made it happen because I found him to be one of the most thoughtful and eager proponents of crypto and in the broader context of what it could mean for a freer world. A lot of people talk about that, but Alex and his team at the Human Rights Foundation are actually doing that. So Alex, with that as the lead, why don't we just dive into your personal origin story and how you ultimately came down the crypto rabbit hole?
Sure. So I've been working at the Human Rights Foundation, which is a nonprofit in New York City that focuses on helping people who live under authoritarian regimes since 2007. And technology and human rights has always been something I've focused very closely at the very beginning. My first job as a summer intern in 2007 was to help put backpacks of information that my colleagues would take into Cuba and give to the underground library movement, where information is power and where books are banned by the Communist Party. And we were bringing in different kinds of dubbed films and texts and things like that. And people would kind of have discussion groups in their homes. This later turned into what was called the Paquete movement, where people would actually smuggle receivers, satellite receivers, and then like people in the neighborhoods would download a huge amount of content and then share it. So that's kind of what's happened since. But that was my first exposure to how important technology and information could be in aiding people who live under dictatorships. Later on, I spent a lot of time working with North Korean refugees and defectors through our Flash Drives for Freedom program. I've visited South Korea many, many times to meet these people who'd escaped and work with them and figure out what they needed. And really what they needed was just solidarity, attention, interaction. They're very ignored by the government in South Korea. They are very ignored by South Korean society, but they're doing noble work. You know, they're sending information to the people they left behind, right? So we want to help them with that. So we've been able to send in tens of thousands of flash drives and USB sticks with outside information, movies, books, films, again, demonstrating the power of information. I've also worked at HRF to help coordinate trainings for activists and journalists with regard to digital security, how to browse the internet privately, how to communicate privately, etc. So that's been a big part of our agenda since 2013. We've been very, very active in that area of digital security. And, you know, before then it was like kind of, I don't know, the narrative sort of shifted, right? Because Arab Spring happened and everybody was like, oh, technology is going to be great. And then people realized, oh, wait, it's maybe not going to be so great. This long arc of history, which looked like it was Steven Pinkerish getting very better for everybody on average up to the year 2000-ish, starts to bend in a different direction if we don't take certain steps now with regard to privacy and freedom, is kind of what I realized. And that was right about the time when a friend of mine named Bill Tai, who's on the board of Bitfury, he started talking to me in 2016 about maybe putting together a human rights activist with the Bitcoin community. So a few months later, we did our first little, very basic informational workshop at one of our events, and then ever since, I've been down the rabbit hole with a focus on how can this stuff help people in authoritarian regimes. So my focus is very, very different from someone who's just trying to make a quick buck or who's trying to innovate on something or create the new next thing or whatever. I'm just trying to see, hey, could this stuff actually resist like attacks from sovereign nations? Could this thing actually hold up? Could it provide value? And that's what drew me in particular to working so closely with Bitcoin.
And there's normally a discovery phase and then an action phase. Some people that's very compressed, some people that is drawn out of the multiple market cycles. So you first heard about Bitcoin, and it was when?
I mean, I had a pretty interesting introduction to it. I used to go to this thing called Ephemerile, which is a party in the Sacramento River Delta with a bunch of like engineers and Burning Man people and whatever. Mm-hmm. It was really fun. And I went in, if I'm correct, 2013, 14, 15. And I think if it was maybe the first or second time I went, I shared a boat with Brock Pierce, and he was like really gung-ho at the time about Bitcoin. And he had brought a cash, like a fake ATM to like use as a prop during his little talks out on the boats that we would tie together. Mm-hmm. And I just remember that. And unfortunately, I mean, I even have this email from, I think even earlier than 2013, of a guy named Idan Yago, who I'd met at Ephemerile. Yep. And he's trying to pitch me on the human rights side of Bitcoin. And I was kind of like, whatever, man. And it really wasn't until I even tweeted. I mean, I remember reading Mark Anderson's piece in the New York Times in 2014 and sharing that and being like, that's really cool about Bitcoin. But it didn't really fall into place for me until Bill Tai was like, hey, no, we should actually do this. And then I was forced with like actually being like, hey, I should actually learn about this in a serious way if I'm going to continue. So it's really been, I'm kind of in my, let's say, working on my fourth year of being serious about this. And it's been, an incredible journey. I mean, every day, just learning.
And the reason I ask, especially for what you're talking about, the market gyrations have been extreme, but most people, I'd say, that have been around recognize the value of these manic cycles in building the long-term capital base and infrastructure base for the rest of the industry. So essentially the tools that you need to power any type of actual at-scale commerce or payments applications or security infrastructure so that you could actually use Bitcoin as a bona fide currency. The proverbial Swiss bank account in your pocket, which has a negative connotation, but not if you're a dissident, right? Not if you're someone that's either being exploited.
Yeah, man, it's all about your perspective.
At risk, right?
And I know my perspective was very unique because my nonprofit is arguably the only one that focuses explicitly on authoritarianism, mm-hmm. which is, to me, I wish we had more copycats because the problem is so massive. There's 4.18 billion people who live under some kind of authoritarian regime today across 95 countries. But, I'm just thinking about them and I'm hearing their stories, and they talk about money a lot. They just never think about including it in their presentations on stage. I'll explain. So in Eritrea, I was sitting down with someone who'd escaped from Eritrea, which is known as like the North Korea of Africa. It's a country in Eastern Africa, on the Horn of Africa. And it's been ruled by a very brutal dictator who really turned his country into a police state after 9/11. And a lot of these Western democracies and other states after 9/11 became much more friendly with a lot more dictators in this region because, of course, terrorism, right? So she was telling me that like about 10 years ago, the country just demonetized the currency completely. It wasn't like India where they had like one note and then they replaced it. The entire currency. Same thing happened in North Korea around the same time. So people in like the most repressive areas have the most financial repression. And it was something that I had to kind of dig out because they don't talk about it as a matter of like, I'm going to put this in my presentation before I go speak at the Oslo Freedom Forum. No, I had to kind of dig. And you talk to the Zimbabweans, same thing. I invited one of them to speak about hyperinflation at an event I did a few years ago in San Francisco. And the guy's like, really? I've never talked about economics. I'm like, no, we just want to hear your story about what it was like to live under that, right? And he comes and he gets on stage and he takes out his necklace and he's like, actually, we all wear this necklace. It's the Zimbabwean dollar from 1980, and it's on his neck. And he's like, all of us in the opposition movement, a lot of us wear this thing as a symbol and memory of what our economy used to be. So if you actually like ask them and push a little bit in this direction, you get some amazing content, amazing content. I was with the guy who's the top diplomat to ever escape from North Korea, Mr. Tae Young-ho. And I started chatting with him about this. He speaks perfect English. And he was telling me, he went into the gruesome details of how the guy who presided over the demonetization scheme in North Korea in 2009 or whatever, which didn't work at all. Like, people ended up protesting by not going to these like black markets, basically, that the government requires for the economy to work. It was a disaster. And he told me about how that person was executed and with which gun and stuff. So it was really interesting. So, and then, then you start looking more closely at the human rights community globally, and you realize they all have problems with their bank accounts. Their bank accounts get frozen frequently. I was talking to a Nicaraguan. She hasn't been able to have a bank account in her name for 2 years. There's a guy in Russia that we were supporting. We had to pay him in cash. We had to fly him to America and pay him in cash to reimburse him, because he would get arrested if we wired him money. So, and look at Hong Kong, man, the second biggest organization that's supporting with legal and medical help, the protesters, had its bank account frozen by HSBC. So this is like a global issue, and it is something that I feel Bitcoin can play a role in. So what I'm trying to do when you talk about going from learning to action, what I'm trying to do is set up workshops. We started doing this already. So we've done this, but we want to do more of these. We bring in some like civil society groups or journalism outfits or groups operating in tough environments who have already had issues with bank account freezing, delays, etc. And we basically, what we want to do is have them bring their computer and phone in, and we'll set up BTC Pay server on their website so they can relatively privately collect Bitcoin donations from people from around the world, and then have that dump into a phone that they control that's non-KYC, and then teach them about when they need to spend it, how to do so, like in whatever city they're in. So in some cities, it's Bitcoin ATMs. Like in Hong Kong, the Bitcoin ATMs don't require KYC. So you can just go and withdraw and no one's the wiser. In other cities, you're going to have to use, like in the Philippines, there are stores you can go into, brick and mortar stores. In other countries, it's going to be done over WhatsApp. We want to encourage people to not use KYC exchanges in this environment. So there's a lot of learning and a lot of discussions, but ultimately we believe this can be a really valuable lifeline for activists and journalists under threat. So that's kind of what I'm focusing on right now, as far as action, taking what I've learned and putting it into action.
If you basically said exactly what you said, but in the 90s, pre 9/11, I don't feel like it would sound very radical. But now we've just gotten so conditioned that KYC, AML, of course, we want to make sure that money launderers aren't able to take advantage of the banking system, even though they do at scale, right?
But just on that note, we had a presentation from someone who works in banking, who does a lot of work in crypto. And she is on their compliance side, basically. And it was great. I had her come in, and she gave a presentation of financial surveillance in the United States, the history of it, to these activists from around the world. And, she talked about, why the Bank Secrecy Act, and, the fact that it didn't really have a lot of teeth for decades, not until 9/11, right? And then after 9/11, everything's changed. Whole Patriot Act thing, let's take your civil liberties away for security. What a lot of people didn't realize is it was not just being done with your communications and your telecommunications, but also your money and your banking, right? So there's this whole thing now where, I don't know if you saw this New York Times piece the other day, but showed that our government spent $100 million over 4 years to spy on people's telecommunications in a warrantless way that was probably illegal. And they got one case out of it, one meaningful piece of information. Yeah. So this is happening with your transactions too. So when you buy something from Coinbase, let's say, an asset, and you move it into your own wallet. Hey, I'd like a third party to have to get a warrant to get that data from Coinbase. That would make sense. But unfortunately, that's not what's happening right now, right? So we need to be as aggressive with regard to our financial privacy as we are with our communications privacy.
I agree with you. I think many people that are in crypto agree with you, which is why you've probably found a number of kindred spirits and supporters. At the same time, you have to do some de facto KYC of yourselves, because as a brand, as a human rights group, you can't afford to make a bad calculation on who is an activist versus who ultimately blows himself up. And not to say that situation has necessarily arisen, but it would only have to happen once out of the many hundreds or thousands of people that you support. So how do you toe this line, right? Yes, I think we agree that default privacy and default non-surveillance or non-authoritarianism is a better society to live in. But if you're going to promote that and then you're wrong just once, it can be used against you and it could potentially blow up the entire movement.
It's a great moral dilemma to discuss. But you know what? We've been through it before many times with encryption. So we had the same exact conversation with regard to, well, should you be telling activists about PGP and Signal? To me, this is the same exact conversations. Should you be telling them about Bitcoin? I would much rather them live in a world where they have more tools in their toolbox and they know how to use PGP and Signal and a proper VPN, and they understand the risks and they know what Bitcoin is and they understand how to use it if they can, and they understand what the risks are, far rather that they be in that position than be ignorant. So to me, you can frame it as a dilemma, but it's not a dilemma to me. I'm like 100% on the side of let's educate them, get them the information, let them make the decisions about whether or not to use it.
I think that makes sense, but you still have some discretion over which activists you're
Yeah. These workshops I'm talking about are completely private, off the record. We're going to pre-select groups that are already semi-robust, are already in the position to receive donations and are having trouble with it, right? So Hong Kong Free Press is a great example. It's not a group we've worked with, but I'm going to use it as an example where, they've been accepting Bitcoin donations for a while, and a significant amount of them has been really helpful for them because a lot of people who want to donate to them don't want to reveal their privacy. And for a long time, they were using BitPay, which was like a disaster because then BitPay froze their account, arguably, I guess, because of pressure from the Chinese government, which is why my friend Leo Weiss came to the rescue and got them set up with BTC Pay. That's why BTC Pay Server is such an important project. So now you can donate to them, and I'm proud to say you can donate to HRF too with BTC Pay today, and you can do it in a way that preserves your privacy. And I think that's really important. So that aspect is not discussed enough.
How much of your funding currently comes from Bitcoin? It sounds very in theory, but in general.
So the first time we accepted Bitcoin as a donation was in 2014. So one of our supporters wanted to pay for his Oslo Freedom Forum tickets in Bitcoin. And we were like, at the time, like, what, really? Like, this is weird. Should we do this? So we discussed and we were like, okay, let's do it. So we actually started accepting some Bitcoin donations. It wasn't like something we were advertising. Like, people were coming to us and saying, hey, I've got some Bitcoin. Can I use it to pay for tickets to go to your events? So that ended up being, pretty favorable for us over the years. I would say it's certainly not been a large percentage, a very, small overall percentage, very small overall percentage of our income. I mean, minuscule, but it is starting to become a thing now that I think will be more favorable in the future. My personal goal, of course, is to get people to think about planting a seed today that could grow into a tree tomorrow from a charitable point of view. So especially as we potentially enter another bull market in the next year or two, I think there'll be people who are more interested in giving back in a certain way. And I hope initiatives like this can be something that they consider.
Outside of payments to certain people that you're working with, are there specific programs that you want to get off the ground or specific partnerships like BTC Pay that are in the works for this year or that are
there's
targeted on a specific jurisdiction or geography?
There's three areas that I think HRF can be helpful. Education. So just getting out in front of people, talking about this issue, dialoguing with them, introducing them to these concepts. And even personally, that's why I wrote the Little Bitcoin book with a bunch of people, because we wanted to, in 100 pages, get the main ideas across in a way that was digestible. And now it's like in 5 or 6 different languages.
And for those that don't know, the story here is fascinating. So the Little Bitcoin book was a book that was written by, around a dozen
8 people. 8 people.
Eight people
Yeah.
in less than a week. It was like Jimmy Song,
Lily Liu,
Lily from formerly from EARN, and a few others just got together and just pounded out this 100-page Bible that is open source and is now available in all these languages. What was that process like?
Yeah, I mean, again, like when it comes to like how I can hopefully play a role, let's dive into that. But just to finish the previous thought. So education, security training, as I described, something I want to do a lot more of. And then general research, like I want to do a lot more research in the field about how are people using money in difficult places. But on the education piece, when we decided that let's write a book, I think the incentive and the interest in doing so came from a realization that a lot of the Bitcoin books out there were technical or ideological in some way and weren't like for the average person. And each 8 of the 8 of us had a different person in mind when we were writing the book, right? So we actually sat down. Jimmy had us do this really fun exercise where we wrote the book review from the point of view of the person we wanted to read the book before we started. And some people were like writing for their mother. Some people were writing for like the average young smart student in a particular country, et cetera, et cetera. And Luis, I remember from the Philippines, was writing for an older businessman. So we each had our own audience, and that really helped us identify what were the common themes that we needed to hit no matter what. Okay. So the first day was like a design sprint where we went through all these different ideas and used Post-its and figured out what the table of contents would be. And then the second day was just drafts. So we each grabbed a chapter basically, and we each like wrote 3,000 to 4,000 words as a draft for that chapter. And then the remaining 2 days were, the 7 of us who didn't write the chapter were just going through those edits. So each of us went through each chapter. So each chapter got massive numbers of edits. All the while, Luis was doing the graphic design and layout for the book, so that by the time we left the house that we were all staying at, it was almost there. We did get some professional editors and some other things, and it took a few weeks to get to, for us to put it up on Amazon. But the point is, it happened quite quickly, and it was a really fun experience. I think we had some big debates.
But anyone that's ever written before realizes that's insane. That publication speed, right? So to get something out the door that quickly.
No, it was really something we prided ourselves on, but it forces you to just it forces you to make concessions because you're going so fast. So we had some non-serious arguments, like Oxford comma was like a big one.
Which side did you fall on?
I like the Oxford comma, but a lot of people who are more programmers,
we can continue this conversation.
But a lot of people are like very against it. No, but there were other big ones. Like, look, I have a particular, I share with some of the other co-authors that, look, I'm a little skeptical. Let's say that like, it's been 100% positive that we've lived under the dollar standard for the last 50 years. I'll admit and acknowledge, of course, there's been a big, positive things about the growth of the world, but like for a lot of people in a lot of countries, it hasn't been so great. So I think there was a big debate about how we present, the dollar standard, how neutral we should be. And then in addition, I think there was thoughts about how money printing and basically control over money has had a relationship with war in history. And this was like controversial. We argued about this a lot. We ended up including some of it. But just to give you an example, obviously in World War I, the Deutsche Mark before the war was worth a certain amount. And then after the war was worth 1/1,000,000th of that amount because the German government decided to go off the gold standard and just print endless amounts of it to pay for soldiers. And had they not made that decision, they wouldn't have been able to fight as long. And obviously many less people would have died. And arguably, you can say this whole thing led to the hyperinflation that allowed Hitler to go into power. So there's actually like a really important lesson there. But we were arguing about that a lot. Like, is it even, is this scientific, historically legit thing to say that abuse of money by governments has led to war, right? So there were some really deep philosophical conversations and arguments we had that were very enriching, that I'm very grateful for. But we ended up having those arguments.
Did those make the book, or were those?
Yeah. So like a little bit. Like if you read the first chapter is like about what's wrong with money today. It doesn't even mention Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. And yeah, we do talk about the fact that like a lot of decisions about money are not made with the people. Like people have no say in those decisions. So it's not like in 2001, the government came to you and said, hey, we're going to fight a forever war for the next 20 years. And each household's going to pay, this many $1 million. Like, how do you want to pay, by check or by, PayPal or whatever? No, they did it without asking. Right. So it even persists today in democratic societies. So I think
this was the rise of libertarianism and Ron Paul in the country for so long. And you could argue that there was a sizable element of Trump supporters that fell into this camp because say what you will about Trump. I think Peter Thiel had an excellent interview where he makes the point that he was the most non-interventionist, non-violent candidate, which is why Thiel supported him. And you could argue that this, 20-year history with Afghanistan and Iraq played, a meaningful part in the support for what is now a much bigger sea change in American politics. And many would argue for the worst. I want to try to stay away from politics of it, but
just to put a cap on that. Obviously, yes, there's this interesting area of Bitcoin that brings together both, I would say, left and right wing isolationist types, which I'm not really on that wavelength. I think America needs to be a little more active in the world than I think they would like to see. But it's fascinating. Anyway, these arguments and conversations you get into, but we finished the book, we got it out there. It's now in a bunch of different languages. I think it's serving as a very useful educational tool. And I'd like to do a lot more of the educational piece, the training piece, and then the research piece over the coming years. So that's kind of where I'd like to focus my time.
Yeah. So we only, we spent the lion's share of the time on that as like an education piece, or at least an example. So elaborate on the other two pillars.
Well, over the years, I've been fortunate enough at HRF to be able to cultivate relationships with some of the best journalists in the world and work with them in different ways. And they often come to the Oslo Freedom Forum. So I've been able to, again, be fortunate enough to allow me to publish some thoughts about Bitcoin in mainstream media. So I've been able to write about Bitcoin for CNN, for Time Magazine, getting content up at Bloomberg, Forbes, etc. So that's my goal. I mean, I really want to speak to the people who are not already in Bitcoin. That's like really my goal. I would like to show them a little bit of this. And this is what I do through Singularity University as well. I teach the executive program there, and I do a course on the future of money where I talk about CBDCs and the DCEP project in China and what's happening there. I talk about what could happen with things like Libra, and then I talk about Bitcoin, and I kind of like show them the pros and cons of each. And they're like 70 CEOs of big companies from around the world. And we have a big argument. It's great. A lot of them are bankers. And it's like pretty robust, but I really like doing this educational piece where I talk to people who don't know anything about it. Like yesterday, I just spoke to a university in San Francisco, a bunch of students, super fun. So that's what I like doing, as opposed to kind of speaking to the already, interested. So that's, I guess, what I mean by the education piece. And especially in HRF's context, obviously I would love to teach as many human rights activists as possible about this idea. And unlike people who are like, on Wall Street or whatever, who are like skeptical, when you tell these people there's a money that's not controlled by governments or corporations, they're like, I'm listening, tell me more, as opposed to like, shut up or whatever. So it's a very receptive audience.
Well, I think, unfortunately, the role of HRF is only going to become more pronounced in its importance. And organizations like HRF, given what's happening right now with the coronavirus. The interesting thing is this is probably going to drop in 2 weeks. So people are going to get a glimpse of whether we're insane and we're totally overblown in terms of the potential impact, or whether this is prophetic, because we'll have the benefit of hindsight when it goes live. But my fear is that what's happening right now in China is maybe the best case scenario for containment, at least their response now, not the initial response and the censorship of the doctors there and some of the early officials. But at least their response since is unprecedented, and it's going to be impossible to replicate in the West in particular, and the non-authoritarian regimes. What tends to happen in situations like that where federal or authoritarian governments get more power is they generally don't cede it after it's been granted.
Correct.
Post-crisis. So you can see
even in the democracies, look at the Patriot Act.
Exactly, right? Exactly. And I think it's why it's healthy to compare, we call them the forever wars. You talk about we talked about KYC, AML, pre and post Patriot Act. I think many people, I certainly feel this way, are worried about what happens in the aftermath of something like the coronavirus, if it truly does become a major worldwide pandemic with relatively high mortality rates and puts the type of stress that we think it could put on the healthcare system. What are your hopes for if the worst case plays out, which we don't really have control over? So it's not like we're rooting for it or against it. Obviously, we're rooting against it, but if you're just looking at the numbers and you're fearing for the worst, what comes next, right? And what is the role of HRF and folks within crypto and like-minded individuals to fight the fight against the permanent extension of the surveillance state and more authoritarian?
So there was a great study put out recently by The Economist that looked at data over the last, several decades, going back to the mid-century, the 20th century. And it was looking at the correlation between epidemics and democracies and dictatorships. And the correlation is very, very clear that you have a worse spread of disease in closed societies. And this is something that you could maybe call the Chernobyl Effect, which is basically the trade-off that people make inside dictatorships or authoritarian regimes to support a narrative that is in favor of the ruling party as opposed to public health. And while this is not entirely missing in democracies, it's way, way smaller because obviously power is divided in democracies and people have shorter terms and there's term limits and there's a free press and there's all these other things. So in the same way that Amartya Sen once observed that there's never been a famine in a democracy ever. This is an incredible piece of information. All of the famines in the world have either been caused by colonialism, occupation, dictatorship, etc. All the top 10 famines of the last 100 years, all man-made by dictatorships, whether it was in the Soviet Union or in British-occupied Southeast Asia or India, or whether it was in North Korea or Ethiopia, etc. You can do all the digging into this. It's fascinating. But on the same level, with regard to public health, you have this effect where, like, let's just put it this way: had the coronavirus started in Atlanta, Georgia, the U.S. government would not have been hunting down doctors and putting them in black bags and sending them away. And, that has a direct impact on how the virus spreads, obviously, with regard to, A, how the public perceives it, and B, how we can spread information most effectively about how to contain it and how to address it. This is being seen even more ridiculously in Iran right now. So China is, obviously, we've seen what's happened in China and how the Communist Party mishandled it. And it could very well be another crack in the wall for them towards their eventual demise. Now, we've seen only what we've seen. I've seen a lot of reports leaking out from Chinese human rights activists that it is really bad in prisons in China right now. And there's not a lot of information about that. You won't find that. But if you'll see little glimmers of it. But there are reports of entire prisons where everyone's infected. There are reports of some really gnarly stuff. And if you think about the conditions that people are in, for example, in prison camps in Xinjiang, I mean, these people are already in concentration camps. Can you imagine the ravaging of these camps where there's literally no medical staff? I would also point your attention to North Korea. Obviously, there's an outbreak in South Korea. There's outbreak in China. Who's in the middle? So, there was a report, I mean, who knows, that the North Korean government was basically just rounding up people and shooting them and burying them. I mean, the thing is, that's not any different from what they do anyway. So in the North Korean government's perspective, whether you're sick in the mind, being a dissident, or sick of the body, we're going to treat you all the same. right? So there's a lot of like death and suffering that's not being talked about. And when it comes to the case of Iran, it was the Chernobyl effect was even greater, because there are dissidents posting videos like on Twitter, like through their networks, like they do anyway, of doctors and like scenes from hospitals. And the government was covering the whole thing up, allowing citizens to leave, go on planes to Europe and Canada and stuff. And they just weren't telling anyone about it because they were hoping it would blow over so it wouldn't damage their reputation that's already in tatters. So, I mean, hope to God it doesn't spread further, but you can imagine what this would do, like what this disease would do in the prison camps in Xinjiang or in a place like Syria or Yemen, etc. So it's sad, but at the end of the day, authoritarianism is really bad for humans, especially with regard to public health.
Go figure. I think that paints a pretty bleak near and medium term picture for some of those other countries. But let's talk about the impact on democracies, right? Because yes, the initial communications may have been botched by some of these authoritarian regimes. China's one extreme example. Singapore is often referred to as the friendliest authoritarian state in the world, right?
Yeah, it is. It's as long as they say it like that. That's accurate, actually.
Right, but my point is they have done what appears to be a phenomenal job in containing the outbreak of the virus, right? So you can look at the situation in China and Iran. You can look at the situation in Singapore, and if you are looking to grab more control and centralize more control, you will obviously point out and communicate the Singaporean example versus the Chinese or the Iranian example. The question then becomes, how do you ever reclaim that after a period of crisis? And I don't know that there's certainly no easy answer, but I'm curious how you've thought about communicating this and being a vocal proponent of this, even amidst the crisis, as a bit of forewarning, and then, in particular, what efforts would need to be made afterwards, so that we don't get into a situation like we did with the Patriot Act and financial surveillance.
I think that what may end up happening, I mean, you're already seeing a little bit of this with, like, in China, like they're confiscating cash under the pretext that it could spread the disease, which actually makes sense. I do think that in 20 years, 30 years, people will look back and kind of laugh at the idea of paper money, at just how many germs it has on it, et cetera. But that's one of the reasons I'm very into financial freedom and privacy and working with Bitcoin, because I think we need to have a replacement that protects our privacy and our sovereignty in a world without cash. But I also would say that, like in democracies, the thing that we have as a benefit that those other societies don't have is the free flow of information. So I do feel like if we harness that correctly, it will be much better for us. And, a lot of that's actually being borne out. You're seeing like very high number of cases reported in South Korea, right? But you know what? They're not trying to hide anything. So it's unclear, what proportion. Like, obviously, I'm sure you and I both don't believe the 2,500 death toll in China number. Not when like entire families are dying, not when there are entire prisons being infected and we don't know about them. But in South Korea, like those numbers are kind of like the numbers, right? And I think that democracies will give us a little bit more of a picture of reality when it comes to how societies are dealing with pandemics. I think Taiwan is being quoted as basically being the paradigm for how you would handle this properly. I mean, they are doing an outrageously good job in almost every possible case. And I would seek people to point people out to look at what the Taiwanese government's been doing. And they are relying on their openness to fight this thing. Singapore, of course, relies on its police state capabilities to fight it. But you got to remember, Singapore is a huge exception in the world of dictatorships, a huge exception. It is a very rare city-state, unique case. Most dictatorships are much closer to China or Iran in the way that they would handle a crisis like this. So take a look at Taiwan. Sympathize with the South Koreans. I mean, I know that Moon is getting raked over the coals for his response to this thing, but at least they're not fabricating data. There's some crazy stuff going on in South Korea, man. There's cults and protest movements that are ignoring the warnings, and they're going out in streets. And there's this thing I saw last night that was so crazy. There's a cult in South Korea that I think it was they had tested 1,800 of these cult members, and 82% of them have tested positive for the disease. And there's like 100,000 of these people out there, and it's like we don't, and they're all gathering in a way that's unsafe because these people are anti-science. Like, it's wild. So it was the same in Iran, right? They were like, go to Friday prayer last week. Go to Friday prayer, and you've got cities like Qom where, God, there's just like entire death wards in hospitals. So again, like, dictatorships and censorship don't mix well with public health. So this is an unfortunate lesson for the world, but hopefully, the more work we can do with journalism and free expression and civil liberties, privacy, the better this sort of thing could become. One other thing I'll mention that's a really interesting side effect of this, potentially long-term, is I do think that face masks become more of a normal thing to use, and especially as they get more effective, as people work on them more. And that is interesting because it really frustrates facial recognition. I know it's not going to be a cure-all because they're working on gait analysis as well and other things. But I'll take that as a win,
Any incremental win that fights back against the Leviathan. Alex, how do you hope to engage with the broader crypto community in 2020 beyond? We talked about some of the education, research, and other initiatives that you have underway. Where can people get involved? How do you envision further integrating with the crypto community beyond just informing people and your network about the power of encryption and encrypted money?
Yeah. So I'm focusing very closely on regulation and privacy right now, because there's gonna be some big battles ahead. Obviously, these are raging all the time, but I always point people to look at 2017 with Bitcoin as an example of how, these Chinese miners and corporates tried to take over Bitcoin, and it didn't work. And we're going to get more of those attacks as we move forward. And in Bitcoin, I think we're going to get those attacks against privacy and also in favor of inflation. And I think these are really important things for people to be able to fight back. And unfortunately, I think the coalitions that are going to build that are going to be against adding privacy tech to Bitcoin Core, and who are also going to be pushing this narrative that we should add a little bit of inflation, are both going to be really powerful. So I think those are going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, and it's going to be tough. And if people are interested in a money project that's sovereign and is not controlled by corporations or governments, there's only one side to be on in those fights. So that's something I'm really looking at is what are possible measures to take if privacy is regulated out of existence? Meaning, what happens if in Coinbase your ability to withdraw to a private wallet just disappears one day? If what would happen? That's a worry for me, right? I would imagine that would be a worry for anybody regardless of which cryptocurrency you're working on. And it's a possibility. I mean, I don't think it's an immediate possibility. I think fine folks at Coin Center and other places are doing good work to educate lawmakers about First and Fourth Amendment and how these things work. But this is an area that I'm trying to dive really deep into and see what can be done. I do think that you will see a Supreme Court case in the next couple of years about privacy. And I think specifically with regard to Bitcoin and this practice of coin joining, I think that that will probably go to, if not the Supreme Court, at least it'll be a big federal court case. And it'll basically be do businesses have to do business with people who coin join or not? Is it legal for them to discriminate against people who want to protect their privacy? I think that would be a really interesting thing to think about. Again, as long as you're working in a currency, a community that uses UTXOs, right? Which is most. So that's going to be big. As far as what's going on at HRF, I want to do more workshops. I want to bring more human rights activists into to be able to talk to people who can talk to them about financial freedom and privacy. And I think doing more research would be really interesting. So partnering with organizations to get some research to learn about what's going on in some of these communities around the world where they're not going to face the same issues as we do in the United States. Like, we're going to have this big battle over KYC AML. Meanwhile, in Nigeria, like, all the stuff's traded on WhatsApp, and there's just no, you know what I mean? It's just going to be a very different paradigm, right? Mm-hmm. In China, I don't know if you've seen these apps that people use to buy Bitcoin, but there are these very popular apps. I'm not going to name them, but you can go find them. But they do billions of dollars a day, and like, you don't need to KYC to start to create an account, or to even do some volume. You need to start doing more KYC to do larger volumes. But it's like, the Chinese government does not have a problem with this right now. I mean, obviously they have bigger fish to fry at the moment, but like, they're not cracking down on this, which to me is so bizarre and so strange. And I always see people like, everybody's always like worried about how much of the Bitcoin infrastructure is in China, right? And I think it's interesting to look at China as a canary in the coal mine. Like, when will they crack down on this? Like, right now, Chinese retail citizens are just buying billions of dollars of Bitcoin, in a week, every week, with very little KYC. A lot of it's OTC. When will that come to an end? But if it doesn't, it says like it's right? Can it, right? Like, can they enforce it?
Well, not only can they enforce it, but is there some tipping point where, especially given they have bigger fish to fry, right? Mm-hmm. Is there some tipping point where it would create such enormous amounts of unrest to essentially steal from or ultimately hurt financially many of the people in your population that are already frustrated with the government and have started to demonstrate a little bit of fight and some pushback on some of the top-down strictures that have been put in place more recently with the coronavirus, but in general. Does this become something where it's tough to shut down, just practically speaking, lest you have a rebellion on your hands? I think, I don't know that we're there yet. I think it's still way too small, but you could make the case that if Bitcoin gets to $1 trillion in market cap, which is, mm-hmm. It's still far away, but it's not that far, $75,000 per Bitcoin, and there, that might be the tipping point where to shut it down would be to destroy too much personal wealth that's in too many hands. But certainly something that we'll keep track of. And we're definitely going to have to do one of these conversations soon, mm-hmm. Especially given some of the work that you have coming out, which we were going to talk about, but I appreciate that we got to wait a little bit.
We'll do more, man. I really appreciate you having me on.
All will be revealed.
Yeah.
There's certainly plenty that the HRF has done. It's at HRF, and Alex, where can people find you?
At Gladstein, Gladstein. Again, grateful for your time. Had fun talking. Hope people can dive into these topics, and feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk more.
Of course. Well, thank you. Hope everyone in our audience enjoyed this episode with Alex Gladstein, and we will be back in just a couple of days with another episode of Unqualified Opinions. Until then, thanks for tuning in. Peace.